A prominent black judge arrives in a rural community to speak on justice reform, only to face blatant prejudice and intimidation. Local officials and police officers subject her to humiliating stops, question her legitimacy, and undermine her authority, all fueled by deep-rooted racist assumptions. They treat her wealth, expertise, and intentions as threats rather than credentials, pushing her to defend herself publicly. These power plays and aggressive tactics expose entrenched racial biases and a system intent on preserving its unfair status quo. The air that morning smelled of fresh rain and distant pine, a gentle reminder that this small town sat in the cradle of lush, rolling hills. Judge Alexis Adebayo stepped out of her rented sedan, smoothed the wrinkles in her linen blazer, and took a careful look around the quiet main street. The place felt suspended in time. Old-fashioned shop signs, a post office that still had a hand-painted eagle above the door, and an antique lamppost that flickered weakly despite it being daylight. It was early, just past 7, and there were few signs of life beyond a newspaper delivery boy on a bicycle and a faded pickup rumbling off in the distance. She could have afforded a driver, of course. In fact, she could have arrived by private car service or even a small chartered helicopter if she wanted. Her name commanded that level of accommodation. At 45, Alexis had scaled the professional ladder to become one of the most respected judges in her circuit. A black woman known for her impeccable legal mind, fair rulings, and quiet influence that reached well beyond her city's borders, but ostentation never suited her. She chose to travel alone in a modest rental car, wearing sensible flats and a blazer she'd had for nearly a decade. To her, being wealthy and powerful was never a license to forget one's roots. If anything, her success made her more intent on blending in, on seeing the world as it was without filters or special treatment. Still, even without trying, Alexis had a certain aura. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, a thoughtful calm in her eyes. Maybe it was the subtle elegance of her gold-rimmed reading glasses or the understated designer watch at her wrist. She took a moment to breathe in the town's quiet, letting it settle her nerves before the day ahead. She'd driven through the night to avoid a crowd, arriving here in Crestwick, a pocket-sized community on the outskirts of nowhere, known only for its scenic overlooks and berry farms. Soon, she would continue on to a statewide judicial conference in the next county, where her keynote speech on sentencing reform and restorative justice was eagerly anticipated. For now, she needed coffee, a decent breakfast, and a moment to gather her thoughts. Her gaze settled on a diner, the only one in sight. It was a squat, pale yellow building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Patty's Diner." The windows were a bit foggy, and she could just make out the silhouettes of a few patrons inside. Perfect, she thought. She wanted to start her day in a simple place, to feel a bit of normalcy before entering the formal world of gavels and legal briefs. As Alexis pushed open the diner's door, a bell tinkled overhead. The warmth inside was immediate. The smell of frying bacon, bitter coffee, and a trace of cinnamon. There were only 3 other customers, a pair of older men in plaid shirts hunched over a corner booth, and a young woman perched at the counter, flipping through a magazine. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a friendly but tired smile, looked up, wiped her hands on her apron, and nodded a greeting. Alexis took a seat at the counter, choosing a worn red stool with a slight wobble. She liked sitting up front. It reminded her of the diners near her childhood home, where she'd learned to read the newspaper on her father's knee as he drank his morning coffee. Back then, their neighborhood had been working class, diverse, and always humming with optimism. She wondered if this town carried any of that same hope, or if it was weighed down by something else. Lately, she'd been hearing chatter from colleagues, reading articles that painted rural communities as battlegrounds over new laws and reforms, some resisting changes intended to bring more equity to the justice system. She wondered if Crestwick was one of those places. "Morning," the waitress said, sliding a menu in front of her. Her name tag read, Martha, and her voice had a honeyed drawl that stretched the vowels. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," Alexis replied softly. "Black is fine." Martha hesitated, her eyes flicking over Alexis's attire and the leather portfolio she'd placed beside her. "You visiting family around here?" she asked, trying to place the newcomer. It wasn't malicious, just curiosity. This diner, Alexis guessed, didn't see many travelers, especially not black women who carried themselves with a quiet confidence and wore tailored blazers. But Alexis knew the question's deeper undertone. You don't look like you're from here. What brings you? Oh, just passing through on business, Alexis said gently, offering a kind smile. I'm headed to a conference a few towns over. The waitress nodded, something unreadable passing across her face. She didn't press. Instead, she fetched a mug, filled it with fresh coffee, and slid it across the counter. The hot steam carried an earthy aroma, and Alexis breathed it in, grateful for the small comfort. Outside, the rain that had threatened all morning finally began, tapping lightly at the diner's windows. The men in the corner booth glanced at Alexis, not rudely, but with the quiet speculation of folks who didn't often see strangers. One of them scratched his chin and lowered his voice, whispering something Alexis couldn't make out. The younger woman at the counter seemed more interested in her magazine than anything else, though Alexis caught her shooting a quick, curious glance. Alexis sipped her coffee and opened the menu. Pancakes sounded good, maybe some scrambled eggs and fruit. She had hours to spare before she needed to be at the conference venue. Checking her watch, she realized she'd made excellent time last night. Despite a successful career, a seat on her state's highest bench, her name floated for a potential federal appointment. Alexis never forgot the value of being early and prepared. That kind of discipline had carved her path through law school and later through the courtroom. As she considered her order, snippets of conversation drifted her way. The men in the booth were complaining about recent changes at the county courthouse. One grumbled about outsiders coming in and changing how things worked. The other muttered about city folks thinking they know best. Alexis knew the tune. She'd heard it before in countless editorials and seen it play out in contentious hearings. Progress often felt threatening to those unaccustomed to it, and reform did not come without resistance. She tried to brush it off today. She was just a traveler with an appetite. Yet she couldn't ignore the tension in their voices. She was, after all, a public figure advocating for shifts in how justice was served, pushing for broader perspectives and fairness in sentencing. She'd championed policies to reduce bias, ensure every defendant got a fair shake, and create pathways for rehabilitation. Her stance had earned her respect in some circles and scorn in others. When Martha returned, Alexis ordered her breakfast quietly, then turned her attention to the newspaper stand by the door. A local paper, the Crestwick Gazette, bore a headline in thick black print. Controversial court reforms spark debate. Below it was a subheading: Rural judges, residents push back on top-down changes. Alexis's eyes narrowed slightly. She wondered if the reforms mentioned were related to the initiatives she'd publicly supported. Perhaps this town was feeling the ripple effects of policies she'd helped shape. Absently, she rubbed the corner of her watch band. She'd bought that watch the year she passed the bar exam, her first luxury purchase. It reminded her of how far she'd come from her modest childhood, where even dreaming of attending law school had seemed extravagant. Now, she shaped the very policies that once might have been considered fantasy. Yet here she was, incognito in a small-town diner, overhearing how her life's work was rattling people who didn't even know her name. The smell of sizzling butter and pancakes rescued her from her thoughts. Martha placed a plate in front of her, the warm, golden stack drizzled with syrup. "Need anything else, honey?" Martha asked, tone a bit softer now. "This is perfect," Alexis said, offering a polite nod. "Thank you." Before Martha could step away, the door jingled again, and two more customers entered, a man in a pressed shirt and a woman wearing a blazer, not unlike Alexis's, though cheaper and more wrinkled. They looked official, maybe county clerks or lawyers. The woman scanned the diner, her eyes landing momentarily on Alexis, then moving on. Alexis kept her head down, cutting into her pancakes as if this were any ordinary morning. But she could sense the shift in the room. The new arrivals exchanged quiet words with the men at the booth. Alexis caught snippets. Hearing coming up. Judge's decision. Not going to stand for it. A mild discomfort settled in her stomach. Were they talking about her court, her rulings? Possibly the state's judicial reforms had stirred a hornet's nest in pockets of the countryside. Some people resisted what they saw as outside interference. Alexis had always believed that fair laws and fair judges benefited everyone, but not everyone agreed. The rain started coming down harder, pattering insistently on the roof. Alexis considered taking her coffee to go and hitting the road earlier than planned. She wanted to arrive refreshed, to step into that conference hall with a clear mind. Yet, something rooted her here. Maybe she wanted a better sense of the sentiment swirling in this town. Understanding the resistance might help her shape her arguments more empathetically in the future. She believed in dialogue, in meeting fear and suspicion with reason. As she finished her pancakes, a sudden hush fell over the room. The two newcomers were speaking more loudly now. The man, tall and lean, seemed frustrated. "These reforms? Can you believe they want to tell us how to run our courts? As if those big city judges know our community better than we do." His companion nodded. "I heard one of them, what was her name? Judge Adebayo. I think she's pushing changes that would force us to reconsider standard sentencing guidelines. It's like she thinks we've been doing it wrong all along." Alexis set her fork down carefully. She felt a prickling at the back of her neck. They were speaking of her directly, casually, as if she were an abstract concept, a distant authority figure. They had no idea she was sitting a few feet away, sipping coffee, hearing every word. Her heart did a curious little jump. Not fear, exactly, but a sudden awareness that her presence here was more than accidental. This was a moment of insight into how her work was perceived on the ground. The older men in the booth chimed in, shaking their heads. "Big shots coming in from the city. Telling us we got to treat some folks differently, reduce sentences, focus on what they call rehabilitation. Means criminals get off easy, if you ask me." "Mark my words," said the tall man. "This Judge Adebayo, she's only getting started soon enough. It'll be even harder for honest folks to see justice done." Alexis remained still, schooling her expression into neutrality. Her chest tightened slightly. She'd seen distrust before, but rarely had she been so close to it while incognito. She understood their fears. Change often felt like a loss of control, especially when it came from people unknown to a community. But she also knew their perspective was too narrow. They saw her as a distant, powerful meddler. In truth, everything she'd done was to create a fairer system, to ensure that race and class no longer determined a defendant's fate before they even stepped into a courtroom. Martha approached, refilling Alexis's coffee. If the waitress sensed the tension, she didn't show it, though her eyes flickered uncertainly from the newcomers to her quiet customer. Alexis thanked her softly, offering a small, gracious smile. She would not reveal herself now. She would not stand up and announce, "I am Judge Adebayo, and I'm not here to ruin your world." No, that wasn't her way. She believed in measured dialogue, in facts and empathy. But she did feel a pang of sadness that these people assumed so much without understanding the reasoning behind the reforms. The rain hammered harder. Outside, the street had emptied. The newspaper boy had long since vanished, and the lone pickup was gone. Inside the diner, Alexis took another sip of coffee, considering her next move. She could leave quietly, continue on her journey, and deliver that keynote with renewed clarity about why her work mattered. Or, perhaps she might speak, very gently, just to ask a question, to learn more about their concerns. Not to reveal herself, but to open a door, however small, to understanding. For now, she opted for silence. She finished her meal, savoring the warmth of the diner. She would pay her bill, thank Martha, and slip back into the rain. The tension in the diner was a reminder that her fight for justice wouldn't be won in grand statements alone. It would also require patience, listening, and bridging gaps. As she prepared to settle her tab, Alexis felt a calm resolve form inside her. The world outside these small towns might see her as a powerful figure, but in places like this, her influence felt distant and misunderstood. It only strengthened her resolve to keep working for fairness, to ensure that one day, even these skeptical voices might see that her aim was not to harm, but to heal. Steeling herself, Alexis folded her napkin, carefully tucked away her portfolio, and ready to step back into the world, into a rain-washed morning filled with challenges and possibilities. She was ready, more than ever, to face them. Outside, the rain's steady drumming had softened to a gentle patter. leaving the streets slick and shiny under the gray morning sky. Alexis stepped onto the pavement, careful not to let her leather portfolio slip beneath her arm. She glanced at Patty's diner one last time, noting how the figures inside had returned to quiet conversation after she left. They would never know they'd just insulted the very person whose policies they resented. She wondered if that ignorance would change, and if so, how painfully it might happen. The small sedan she'd rented waited at the curb, faint wisps of steam rising from its hood as it adjusted to the damp air. Before climbing in, Alexis took a moment to center herself. She inhaled, counting quietly under her breath. 1, 2, 3, and exhaled slowly. The tension she'd felt inside was still coiled in her chest. Her mind replayed the men's whispers and that unfamiliar woman's mention of Judge Adebayo, spoken with scorn. It hurt, in a subtle but enduring way. People who had never met her, who didn't know what she stood for, had already formed a narrative. If they knew she was that judge, would they treat her any differently? Or would their resentment deepen? A car door slammed nearby. Alexis turned to see the county clerk-looking pair from the diner, stepping onto the street. They had paused mid-step, noticing her beside the sedan. The tall man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to place her. Alexis offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod, and slipped into her car. She started the engine and pulled away, careful and slow, not wanting to draw attention. There was no reason for confrontation. Not yet. The drive out of town was uneventful at first. Crestwick's main road cut through sleepy storefronts and a few homesteads, then wound into gentle hills. As Alexis merged onto a narrower route that led toward the next county, the drizzle picked up once more. Windshield wipers flicked steadily across the glass. She tried to focus on the keynote speech she'd be giving, the points she wanted to emphasize about balanced sentencing, about humanity and fairness, about change not being a threat, but a necessity. Yet her mind kept drifting back to Patty's diner. How many people across the state saw her that way? An outsider meddling in their affairs. A flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror jolted her from her thoughts. A police cruiser, its rooftop lights spinning. Alexis's stomach tightened. She glanced at her speedometer. She was under the limit. Her turn signals had been used. Why would she be pulled over? Perhaps a routine check. She eased the car to the side of the road and rolled down her window, breathing steadily. The cruiser's door opened, and an officer stepped out. A broad-shouldered man wearing a county sheriff's department uniform. He took his time approaching, adjusting his hat, glancing at her license plate, and surveying the back seat of her rental car as he approached. "Morning," he said, leaning down. Droplets of rain beaded on the brim of his hat. "Can I see your license and registration?" "Of course," Alexis replied calmly. She retrieved her driver's license and the rental agreement from the glove compartment, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. She'd given similar advice to her nephews. No sudden moves, be polite, be calm. It was an old survival tactic, learned too many times over in black households. The officer took the documents without a hint of a smile. He inspected them carefully, his eyes flicking from the license photo to her face. "You headed somewhere in a hurry?" "No, sir. Just traveling to a conference in the next county over." She kept her voice even and respectful. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny. He looked at her clothes, professional but unassuming, and then at her portfolio on the passenger seat. "Where you coming from?" he pressed. She paused, considering how much to share. "I stopped at Patty's diner in Crestwick for breakfast," she said truthfully. "Before that, I was on the interstate, making my way here from a larger city." He pursed his lips, tapping her license lightly against the car door. "Haven't seen you around here before. Mind popping the trunk?" That sent a ripple of annoyance through her. What cause did he have for that? She thought of refusing. She knew her rights. There was no stated reason for suspicion, no probable cause, but refusing might escalate the situation. She was alone. It was raining, and he held the power right now. She reminded herself that she was Judge Alexis Adebayo, that she stood for the rule of law and would handle this with grace. But oh, how it rankled that she felt safer complying than asserting her rights. She took a slow breath and nodded. "Sure, officer." She popped the trunk. He stepped away, leaving her to stare at the raindrops gathering on her side mirror. She thought about stepping out to show she had nothing to hide, but decided to stay put. Let him see the neatly packed suitcase, the file box with printed references for her speech. It was all innocuous. She had done nothing wrong. After a few minutes, the officer returned, rain slicking down his shoulders. He handed her documents back through the window, his face no softer. "We got word of some out-of-towners passing through, causing a stir," he said vaguely. "Just making sure everything's above board." What did that mean? Out-of-towners causing a stir? Was he referring to the tension at the diner, the reforms, or something else entirely? Alexis maintained her composure. "I assure you, I'm just passing through." "Is there anything else you need from me, officer?" He gave her one last appraising look, then shook his head. "No, ma'am. Drive safely." He stood there as she rolled up her window and pulled back onto the road, his patrol car idling behind her. In her rear view, she saw him linger before turning off the flashers and moving on. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A low-level tremor of anger fluttered in her chest. She'd been profiled. There was no other reason. Maybe he suspected a black woman alone in a nice rental car was trouble, or that she was connected to some rumored outsiders. It was all speculation, but experience told her she was likely right. She tried to let it go, but the tension nestled under her sternum. How many times had she spoken on panels about systemic bias in policing, about training officers to see citizens as individuals rather than stereotypes? Now she'd just lived another small, bitter example of why such reforms mattered. Miles later, the road narrowed further, twisting through a quiet stretch of farmland. The rain had eased to a drizzle. She was making progress, but the atmosphere inside the car weighed heavy. She thought about calling her clerk to check on logistics at the conference, maybe center herself by focusing on work. Before she could, a distant shape on the side of the road caught her eye. An old pickup truck stalled on the shoulder, its hood propped open. A figure stood beside it, waving for help. She slowed instinctively. Was it safe to stop? She was wary now, after the diner and the officer. But a person in need was a person in need, and Alexis was not the kind to ignore someone stranded. She pulled over cautiously, leaving enough space. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, approached, clearly relieved. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "My truck died, and my phone's dead too. Could I borrow yours to call a tow?" Alexis studied her face, tired, drenched, and earnest. The woman was white, freckled, with anxiety gleaming in her blue eyes. "Of course," Alexis said, offering a gentle smile. She passed her phone through the window. The woman stepped under the shelter of the doorframe, being careful not to drip too much rain onto the seats. As she dialed, the woman glanced at Alexis and hesitated. "I saw a cop car pass by earlier," she said softly. "He didn't even stop to help. You must have come the other way." Alexis didn't comment on that. Instead, she asked, "Where are we, exactly? I'm new to the area." The woman gave a nervous laugh. "Not too far from Crestwick. Not exactly a town, more like a bend in the road. You headed somewhere particular?" Alexis nodded. "A conference on judicial matters. I'm a judge." The woman raised her eyebrows, surprised but not hostile. "A judge? Wow. Well, good luck. Don't let anyone give you a hard time out here. Some folks don't like people who want to change things." She trailed off, letting that statement hang. Before Alexis could respond, the woman's call connected. She stepped away to talk quietly. Alexis watched through the windshield as a tractor in a distant field rolled along, churning wet earth. She realized the woman's comment aligned with what she'd heard in the diner: resistance to change, suspicion of outsiders. The officer's behavior made a bit more sense in that context, but none of it excused how she'd been treated. The woman hurried back. "Thank you so much," she said, returning the phone. "My brother's on his way. I can handle it from here." Alexis offered a warm nod. "I'm glad I could help." The woman hesitated, as if choosing words. "For what it's worth, I've read about some of these new reforms," she said. "Not everyone's against them. Some of us think it's time my grandfather went to prison for something minor and never got a second chance. Maybe what you're doing could help people like him. Anyway, safe travels." She stepped back into the rain. Alexis pulled away, touched by the unexpected kindness. It was a small reminder that not everyone here was hostile, but the anxiety remained. The prejudice she felt was no figment of her imagination. It existed in the glare of the officer's eyes, in the hushed tones of the diner's patrons. She'd spent her career shaping policies that would help ensure fairness, yet she couldn't always ensure fairness for herself when out of her own domain. As the journey continued, the sky brightened slightly. She was nearing the next county line. According to her GPS, about 20 more miles and she'd be at the venue. Alexis's chest tightened again as she imagined standing before that audience, delivering her speech. Would they see her as a savior, a meddler, or just another figurehead? She needed them to feel the urgency, to understand the cost of their entrenched biases. She couldn't shake the image of that officer, the suspicion in his posture. Traffic picked up slightly as she neared the small city hosting the conference. She passed a billboard advertising a local craft fair, another touting a Bible verse. Then, a police checkpoint came into view, orange cones and 2 squad cars blocking one lane. She slowed, dread settling in. Another encounter with local law enforcement so soon felt ominous. An officer signaled her to stop. This time, it was a woman, tall, stern-faced, and flanked by a deputy. Her badge gleamed in the moody light. "Ma'am, need to see your license again," the officer said briskly. "We're conducting random checks, had some unusual activity in the area." Random checks, Alexis knew full well these were rarely random. She produced her license once more, her voice steady, but with an edge of weariness. "Is something wrong, officer?" The woman looked at the license, her gaze drifting over Alexis's face. "Just a precaution," she said, not smiling. "Where are you heading?" Alexis answered evenly. "A judicial conference at the Greenwood Center. I'm a speaker." The deputy snorted under his breath, as if the idea were absurd. Alexis caught that microaggression. She lifted her chin slightly, trying not to bristle. The officer handed back the license, paused, and then leaned down. "I see," she said, unconvinced. "That's a prestigious event? Got an invitation?" Alexis thought of the formal letter in her portfolio. It struck her as absurd that she was being asked to prove where she belonged. But she complied, reaching for her portfolio and extracting the invitation letter, on official letterhead from the State Judicial Council, her name in bold print as a keynote speaker. The officer read it, her brow furrowing. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, reluctance, maybe disappointment that this woman of color, traveling alone, truly belonged in a place of honor. Finally, she nodded and stepped back, letting the deputy remove the cone blocking Alexis's path. "Move along," the officer said curtly, as though granting a reluctant favor. No apology, no acknowledgement that she'd been overly suspicious. Alexis put the car in drive, her heart pounding with anger. Now she'd done nothing wrong, yet had to prove herself twice in the span of an hour. This was the landscape she worked in. This was why reforms mattered, to chip away at these biases, to ensure people didn't have to constantly justify their existence, their purpose, or their legitimacy. As the center's spire came into view over the next hill, a modern building of glass and steel, her shoulders ached with tension. She was almost there, but the morning's events clung to her like a damp cloak. How would she stand in front of her peers and speak about justice and fairness without recalling her own treatment today? The anger simmered beneath her calm facade. She'd keep it professional. She always did. Yet inside, frustration mingled with helplessness. Wealthy, powerful, and influential as she was, these people had still tried to diminish her, to question her presence. If this happened to her, she wondered, what about those with fewer advantages, those with no titles or invitations, who face these biases daily without recourse? Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. She would channel this anger into her work, into her speech. The audience would never know she'd been stopped twice, searched, doubted, and singled out in their own backyard. But as she composed herself for the upcoming address, she carried that truth silently. She would remember every look, every insinuation, and use it to make her arguments real, urgent, impossible to ignore. Soon, she would step onto that stage, still calm and dignified, her voice steady as she spoke of justice, empathy, and the need for deeper systemic change. The rain had slowed to a mist as she entered the conference center's parking lot, but storm clouds of a different kind still hovered in her mind. She was ready, more than ever, to push forward, even as tension mounted and the stakes rose. She only hoped that her resolve would hold steady as the day wore on, and that fate would not test her patience further before the moment she would need all of her strength and composure. Alexis stepped into the Greenwood Center's atrium, shaking off the last droplets of rain from her blazer. The building was a sleek contrast to the sleepy town she'd passed through. Polished floors gleamed under contemporary lighting, and banners listing the day's panels and keynote speakers swayed softly in the filtered air. Clusters of attendees, judges, attorneys, policy analysts, stood around tall cocktail tables, chatting over coffee and pastries. A stage set with a lectern and projection screens waited at the far end of the hall. She exhaled, smoothing her hair and adjusting her collar. This was familiar territory. The mix of nervous excitement and professional pride that always came before an important speech began to settle over her. Soon she would stand before them all to argue for a more humane justice system, one that recognized bias, gave second chances where deserved, and balanced accountability with compassion. But the tension of the morning still prickled at her. She couldn't forget the suspicious stares, the police stops, the quiet hostility in Crestwick and beyond. It felt like a warning sign. She had to stay alert. As she picked up her registration materials at the welcome desk, a smooth process that confirmed she was indeed the keynote speaker, she tried to push her worries aside. "Judge Adebayo," said a voice behind her. She turned to find Mitchell Carlisle, the event coordinator, approaching with a hesitant smile. He was a short, bespectacled man, in his early 30s, wearing a neat gray suit. She remembered his emails, his careful attention to every detail. "It's wonderful to have you here. We've got a full house this morning. Everyone's eager to hear from you." "Thank you, Mitchell," Alexis replied, offering a cordial handshake. "I'm looking forward to it." His smile wavered as he leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'd be remiss not to mention that we've had some pushback. A group of local officials is here, some community stakeholders who aren't too happy about the reforms you've championed. They've made their feelings known to me already." Alexis met his eyes, steady. "I'm aware that my proposals are not universally liked," she said calmly. "But that's why we're here, to have a dialogue. I'm not easily intimidated." Mitchell nodded, relief seeping into his features. "I'm glad to hear that. Just wanted to give you a heads up. We're set to start in about 20 minutes. He gestured to a side lounge where speakers waited before going on stage. "Your green room is through there if you'd like a quiet space." As Alexis stepped away, she noticed a small knot of uniformed officers by the entrance. Among them stood the tall officer who'd stopped her earlier on the road, the one who had seemed suspicious. He wasn't alone now. Another figure joined him, a broad man in a rumpled suit, silver hair slicked back, wearing a county badge. They spoke in low tones, casting glances at her and at the event staff. A seed of apprehension took root. She needed to stay calm, to focus on her speech. She retreated to the green room, which was actually a well-appointed lounge with a plush sofa, a small coffee table, and a pitcher of water. She took out her notes, reviewing the key points one last time. Each line represented countless hours of research and advocacy. This speech was meant to inspire, but it would also challenge existing power structures, structures that people in these communities might fiercely protect. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mitchell again, looking pale. "Judge Adebayo, I'm so sorry, but we've just had a situation in the lobby. The local sheriff's department insists on speaking with you before you go on stage." Her stomach sank. "On what grounds?" "I don't know," he said, flustered. "They claim it's a security protocol. I've never heard of this before. They're being quite insistent." Alexis rose, folding her notes carefully. "I'll talk to them. It's better to address this directly." As she stepped out, Mitchell followed anxiously. In the atrium, the crowd had sensed something off. Attendees parted as Alexis approached the cluster of officers. The tall officer who'd stopped her car, Officer Daniels, stood at the forefront. Beside him was the older man in the suit, his county badge now clearly visible. The badge read, Underwood, and below it, Assistant District Attorney. "Judge Adebayo," Underwood began, his voice loud enough to reach the curious ears nearby. "I'm afraid there's a problem. We received a tip that someone posing as a judicial officer might try to disrupt today's proceedings. We need to verify your identity and credentials." Alexis's jaw tightened. "I've already presented my invitation and ID at the front desk. I'm scheduled to speak in a matter of minutes." Daniels smirked, crossing his arms. "We're talking about a credible tip, ma'am. We have reason to believe you may not be who you claim." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the surrounding crowd. Alexis could feel the weight of their eyes. She had to stay calm, even as indignation flared. "If you had doubts, you could have asked the conference organizers. I'm well known in my field. This is harassment." Underwood stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only a handful could hear. "You think you can waltz in and push reforms that strip local authorities of their discretion? Not everyone is on board, so, until we're certain of your credentials, beyond a simple letter, you're not stepping on that stage." Mitchell hurried forward, face flushed. "Excuse me, sirs. Judge Adebayo is our keynote speaker. She was invited by the State Judicial Council. I have her biography, her previous rulings, everything you need. This is completely out of line." Officer Daniels ignored Mitchell. "Show us some government ID, something official beyond a driver's license. Judges carry certain documents, right?" He sneered, enjoying the public nature of the challenge. Alexis clenched her teeth. She did have her official judicial ID in her portfolio. Slowly, deliberately, she reached inside and retrieved it. But as she extended it, Daniel snatched it roughly, holding it up to the light. "So easy to forge these days," he said, tossing it back. "We'll have to run it through verification." Underwood nodded. "We have a department official nearby with the tools to confirm authenticity." He gestured to another officer, who took the ID and strode briskly out of sight. The hush in the room was suffocating. Attendees whispered, some outraged, others uncertain. If Alexis stormed off, it would look like guilt. If she protested too loudly, they'd twist it into a threat. She had to stand firm, show composure. Inside, her heart pounded. They wanted to break her resolve, to make her lose her temper. Minutes ticked by, excruciatingly slow. Alexis could see colleagues in the crowd. Some looked on with sympathy, others with confusion. A few were on their phones, possibly tweeting or emailing superiors about this bizarre turn of events. Finally, the officer returned with a grim set to his mouth. "The ID checks out," he admitted reluctantly. "This is indeed Judge Alexis Adebayo." A collective exhale rippled through the room. Mitchell stepped forward again, voice trembling with anger. "There you have it. She is who she says she is now. If you'd kindly let us proceed with the conference." Underwood raised a hand, cutting him off. "We'll see. The tip we received mentioned potential disruptions, possibly even inciting unrest. We can't just ignore that because her ID is real. For all we know, she could still be planning to push an agenda that could cause turmoil." Alexis's cheeks burned, but she refused to lash out. She spoke calmly, voice resonating through the hall. "I'm a sitting judge, dedicated to the rule of law. My agenda is to improve fairness in the justice system. If you consider that disruptive, I'd urge you to reconsider what the law stands for." A new voice came from the crowd. An older judge Alexis recognized from the state's Supreme Court committee, Judge Rothwell. He stepped forward, authoritative in his black suit. "Underwood, Daniels, this is out of line. I can vouch for Judge Adebayo personally. This is a professional conference, not a political rally. Let her speak." Underwood's expression flickered with uncertainty, but Daniels stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "With respect, sir, this isn't just about you. We're protecting our community's interests. These reforms threaten to undermine local authority. People here don't want outsiders telling them how to do their jobs." Rothwell stiffened. "Outsiders? She's a duly appointed judge in this state. That makes her as much an insider as anyone else. You're playing a dangerous game, officer." Underwood cleared his throat. "We have no intention of disrupting lawful proceedings, but we must ensure no harm comes to this community." He cast a pointed look at Alexis. "If the judge wishes to speak, she can do so under supervision. Officers will remain present, and any hint of incitement will be grounds for removal." A ripple of outrage ran through the crowd. Supervision removal for incitement. They were effectively threatening to yank her off stage if they didn't like her words. Alexis's spine stiffened, fear and anger churned inside, but she let them settle into a quiet, steely resolve. She refused to be silenced or intimidated. These tactics, public humiliation, baseless suspicion, were the exact reason reform was needed. Systemic bias, unchecked authority, intimidation of those who sought change. "All right," she said, voice carrying. "Let them stay. I have nothing to hide and no interest in causing harm. My speech will stand on its own merit. My words will speak to justice, fairness, and the betterment of all communities, including this one." Underwood's eyes narrowed. Daniel smirked as if he'd won something. But Alexis knew better. By standing firm, by refusing to yield to fear or outrage, she had shown strength. The crowd watched, and she sensed sympathy shifting in her favor. Even those unsure of her reforms might now see who was acting out of line. Mitchell approached, his hands trembling slightly, whispering, "Your speaking slot is now. Are you sure you want them here?" She nodded. "I'm sure. Let them see what I stand for." Rothwell caught her eye and nodded approvingly. Some others in the crowd, fellow judges, a smattering of attorneys, murmured in support. Alexis realized she had allies here, even if they'd been silent until now. Following Mitchell toward the stage, she felt the officer's gaze boring into her back. She could practically feel Underwood's anger and Daniels's smugness. This was their power play. Put her on the defensive, make her speech tainted by fear. But she wouldn't let them. Her mind raced. She would incorporate this confrontation into her keynote, tactfully, professionally. She'd use it to illustrate the very problem she sought to address, real-life evidence of why trust needed rebuilding, why bias had to be confronted. Her heart still pounded, but not from fear anymore. It thumped with a fierce determination to make this moment count. As she stepped onto the low stage, the audience took their seats. Cameras were set up, and people whispered about the scene they'd just witnessed. Officers Daniels and two deputies hovered at the back of the hall, arms folded. Underwood stood off to the side, lips pressed thin, as if waiting for a misstep to pounce. Alexis approached the lectern, notes in hand. The spotlight warmed her face. A hush fell over the room, the tension thick enough to taste. She surveyed the assembled faces, some anxious, some outraged, some curious, and then settled her gaze straight ahead. "Good morning," she began, voice steady and resonant. "I'm Judge Alexis Adebayo, and I'm honored to speak with you today." She paused, letting the tension linger, acknowledging it without words. "I know that reforms to our justice system can be controversial. Change often feels uncomfortable, especially when it challenges long-standing practices. But change, when guided by principle and fairness, is necessary." Behind her, Underwood stirred, and from the back, Daniels shifted stance. Alexis continued without falter. "Our responsibility as stewards of justice is to face the hard truths that bias, mistrust, and inequity still plague our courts. My proposals, and the proposals of many here, aim not to weaken local authority, but to strengthen our system's integrity. We want every citizen, no matter their background, to feel safe, seen, and treated with respect." The audience leaned in. She sensed the momentum shifting. The hostility from moments before was now fuel for her argument. She would turn these attempts to silence her into a shining example of why the work mattered. But as she spoke, her eyes flicked to the side, where Underwood's phone glowed. He typed something, face grim. At the back, Daniels whispered to another officer. They still waited for any excuse to pounce. Alexis pressed on, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the urgency of this moment. She was no longer just delivering a keynote. She was fighting for the right to be heard, for the principles she held dear. The stakes had never been higher. And while these reforms may unsettle some, I believe wholeheartedly that we can bridge the gap between skepticism and trust, fear and fairness, she said, her voice ringing out. We can build a justice system that lives up to its name. She paused, the silence electric. Every eye was on her, every ear turned to catch her next word. Outside, rain drizzled faintly against the glass. Inside, tension coiled, ready to snap. The next moments would decide if she could prevail over the intimidation, if her stance would inspire others or provoke a crackdown. She took a breath, ready to drive her point home, her gaze sweeping over Underwood and Daniels, then back to the audience. Whatever happened next, she would not be silent. She would not back down. Alexis paused at the lectern, letting her last words linger in the charged silence. Her heart was pounding in her ears. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room, sympathetic allies, skeptical officials, and the cold stares of those local authorities who had tried to block her from speaking. Officer Daniels stood at the back, arms still folded, while Underwood hovered near a side aisle, tension radiating from him as if he were ready to pounce. The air hummed with expectation. She continued, voice steady. No community deserves to be misjudged by distant authorities who don't understand their struggles, but neither should any community fear oversight that could ensure fairness. We must find balance. We must trust that reforms can strengthen justice rather than weaken it. At that, Underwood's mouth twisted into a sneer. He leaned toward Daniels and whispered something. Alexis caught a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. Two uniformed officers stepping closer, skirting the edge of the audience. The crowd sensed something was off. Murmurs rose, attendees shifting in their seats. Judge Rothwell stood near the front, his face drawn tight with worry. Mitchell hovered behind a pillar, looking as if he might be sick. And that, Alexis said, voice unwavering, is the heart of my message today. She glanced down at her notes, but her mind was racing ahead. The hostility hadn't subsided. If anything, it had grown sharper. She could feel it crackling like static in the air. We cannot allow fear to govern our courts. We cannot allow prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, to sway verdicts or sentencing. The law is meant to protect us all, not just a select few. Underwood took a step forward, letting himself be seen. He raised his voice, cutting through the tension. Speaking of prejudice, Judge Adebayo, some might say your reforms are inherently biased against local traditions, that you, an outsider, are telling us how to run our business. Gasps and a low rumble of protest moved through the audience. Alexis allowed herself a calm breath. They were baiting her, trying to force her hand into a confrontation. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of losing her temper. Instead, she lifted her chin. This isn't about my personal background, nor is it about erasing local traditions. It's about ensuring the scales of justice don't tip disproportionately based on race, class, or connections. Underwood's eyes narrowed. And you think you know best? Not alone, she answered, making sure her voice carried. None of us do. That's why we have committees, panels, hearings. We welcome input from local judges, community leaders, and citizens who live with the consequences of our laws. If you believe I'm acting alone, you underestimate the collective voices calling for fairness. Daniels moved then, stepping from the back to the center aisle. His hand hovered near the radio clipped to his shoulder. The atmosphere became charged with a more immediate threat. People in the audience stiffened, uncertain if they should intervene. Rothwell's eyebrows shot up, and he took a half step forward, as if to shield Alexis. But he was too far away. Alexis's mind raced. She needed to maintain control. Any sign of fear or anger could be twisted against her. We can have differences in perspective, she said, calm and firm. But I urge everyone here to listen to one another. Threats, intimidation, these have no place in a forum dedicated to improving justice. Underwood smirked. Intimidation? He turned slowly, addressing the audience. Who's intimidating whom? We're simply ensuring this event remains safe and lawful. After all, we had a credible tip. A voice cut him off from the crowd. This is nonsense. It was Judge Rothwell, finally stepping into the spotlight. We've all seen what's happening. You're harassing Judge Adebayo. She's here at my invitation, and that of the State Judicial Council. If you have any integrity, you'll back down. A murmur of agreement swept the audience. Mitchell visibly relaxed, thankful for Rothwell's intervention. But Underwood didn't flinch. Instead, his jaw clenched. He glanced at Daniels, who nodded as if receiving some silent cue. In an instant, two officers approached the stage, their posture rigid. One of them cleared his throat. Judge Adebayo, we need to speak to you privately, he said. Now! The crowd erupted in protest. This is out of order! She's done nothing wrong! Voices overlapped in confusion and anger. People stood up, some pulling out their phones. Alexis saw the flashing of camera lights, the recording icons. This was becoming a spectacle, exactly what Underwood and Daniels seemed to want. They were banking on fear and chaos to discredit her. Alexis took a deep breath, eyes steady on the officers. She had to be careful. I am currently engaged in delivering my keynote address. I have complied with every identification request. There is no legal basis for you to detain or remove me. Ma'am, the officer insisted, stepping closer, we have reason to believe you're causing unrest. Unrest? Alexis repeated, astonished. By speaking about justice? By encouraging dialogue? She didn't raise her voice, but it carried, projecting through the hall. The audience's uproar grew louder, many now openly filming the confrontation. Daniels pushed forward, voice booming. We're placing you under temporary detainment for questioning. His eyes flashed with triumph. Turn around and step off the stage, Judge. Time seemed to slow. Alexis's heart hammered. They were making their move, escalating this into a public humiliation. If she refused, they'd force her off. If she complied silently, they might spin it as her being at fault. She had to find a third path, something that would preserve her dignity and expose this injustice. Judge Rothwell started shouting, "This is an outrage!" Others joined in, calling for calm, fairness, and respect. Mitchell rushed forward, stammering appeals to reason. The tension coalesced into a single, fraught moment. Alexis lifted a hand gently, calling for quiet. "Everyone, please," she said. And somehow the crowd hushed enough to hear her. She turned toward Daniels and Underwood, her voice taking on a ringing clarity. "I will comply with your instruction, but I do so under protest. This is a violation of my rights as a duly appointed judge. The entire world is watching how you treat a representative of the judiciary who has committed no crime. I hope you understand the precedent you're setting." Underwood's grin faltered. Daniels hesitated, hand still hovering near his radio. The officers approaching the stage exchanged uncertain glances. This was getting messy for them, cameras and witnesses everywhere. The crowd was no longer just a bystander. It was an audience documenting every second. If they arrested her now without cause, the backlash would be immense. Still, they pressed forward. "Please step down," the officer repeated, voice tight. Alexis gathered her notes, her portfolio, and stepped away from the lectern. She moved slowly, with measured grace, refusing to let them see fear in her eyes. The crowd parted to let her pass. She felt Rothwell's hand briefly squeeze her shoulder in silent support. Mitchell's face was ashen, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. As she reached the edge of the stage, Daniels and the other officers closed in. She noticed Underwood step back into the shadows, as if he preferred to observe from a safer distance now that things were heated. Outside the hall's windows, rain still pattered softly, indifferent to the human drama inside. They led her toward a side corridor, the crowd trailing behind at a respectful distance. Voices clamored for explanation. Someone shouted, "This is exactly why we need reforms." Another yelled, "Stand strong, Judge Adebayo." She kept her head high. Inside, she was furious and afraid, but she knew this moment demanded composure. If she lost her temper, it could justify their actions. If she stayed calm, it would highlight the injustice of it all. She had spent years cultivating such restraint in the courtroom. Now it might save her dignity and bolster her cause. As they neared a door labeled "Staff Only," Officer Daniels finally spoke in a low tone, meant only for her. "You think you can walk in here and shame us? You think cameras and titles protect you? This is our territory." Alexis met his gaze. "The law should be everyone's territory, Officer Daniels," she said softly. "If you think what you're doing is right, why hide it behind closed doors?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He looked at Underwood, who had materialized near a side door, glowering. The assistant DA raised a phone to his ear, muttering something into it. Alexis suspected he was calling someone higher up, trying to decide their next move. They hadn't expected so many phones capturing every second. They hadn't anticipated resistance from respected judges like Rothwell. At that moment, Mitchell caught up to them, breathless and distraught. "She's done nothing wrong," he pleaded, voice trembling. "You'll face consequences for this. The media. They're already posting about it online. The state's judicial council will have your heads." Underwood stepped forward, trying to reassert control. "Back off," he snarled at Mitchell. "You have no authority here." Neither do you, Alexis said, calm but firm. You have provided no warrant, no probable cause. This is harassment, pure and simple. Underwood's face reddened. We have reason to believe, he began, but Alexis cut him off. Reason based on what, your discomfort with my message? She took a calculated risk, raising her voice so that those trailing behind could hear. Or is it that I'm a black woman judge, speaking inconvenient truths, that makes you question my legitimacy? A gasp rippled through the small crowd that had managed to follow. Rothwell stood at the back, arms folded, glaring at the officers. Others huddled behind him, some openly recording, ensuring every word Alexis spoke would not be lost. The mention of race cut deep, exposing the raw nerve beneath this charade. It was a danger and a necessity. Naming the bias could escalate tensions, but silence would only embolden them. Underwood's eyes darted around, panic creeping into his posture. He must have realized how damning this looked. Daniels, too, shifted uneasily. Another officer stepped forward, as if to intervene, but then hesitated, seeing the cameras and the intensity on every face. The silence stretched, thick as tar. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from the back of the hallway cut through the tension. Let her go, Underwood. Everyone turned to see who spoke. It was a state official from the Judicial Council, an older woman in a navy suit, her face stony. I've been on the phone with the governor's office, she said, holding up her cell. They are aware of this situation. I suggest you release Judge Adebayo immediately, or the repercussions will be swift and severe. Underwood froze, his expression twisting from anger to fear. Daniels exhaled sharply, looking as if he'd swallowed something bitter. The other officers stepped back, uneasy and uncertain. They were cornered, political pressure from above, public scrutiny from all sides. For a moment, Alexis dared to hope they would stand down. But the intensity in Underwood's eyes hadn't dimmed. It had merely turned calculating. He glanced at Daniels, who shook his head subtly. They might still push forward, hoping to call her bluff, but their window for action was closing rapidly. The audience in the hallway waited, breath held. Mitchell gripped his phone in trembling hands, prepared to document every second Rothwell glared, daring them to make the wrong move. The state official from the council radiated an aura of unyielding authority. Alexis watched it all, her heart thunderous, but face serene. She had stood firm, refused to be cowed, and now the truth was laid bare. The question was, would these men bow to reason and law, or would they double down on their abuse of power? Underwood's lip curled, and he spoke through gritted teeth. Stand down, Daniels. His voice shook with suppressed rage. We'll release her this time. Daniels looked mutinous, but he stepped back, lowering his gaze. The officers retreated, leaving a half circle of open space around Alexis. For a split second, relief fluttered in her chest, but it was fragile. This was not over. The anger, the hatred, the bias, those forces still lingered, poised to strike again if given the chance. She had won this round, but the battle was ongoing. As Alexis remained poised, Underwood snarled low enough that only she could hear. Don't think you've won. You've made powerful enemies today. She met his glare with calm resolve. Enemies or no, I will keep fighting for what's right. He backed away, and the tension in the corridor receded slightly. Mitchell rushed forward, face pale, offering a shaky smile. Rothwell joined them, placing a reassuring hand on Alexis's arm. People behind them murmured in relief, admiration, or quiet disbelief. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping gently on the windows. Inside, in that charged hallway, Alexis stood tall, her allies at her side, her antagonists still hovering in the wings. She'd narrowly escaped a public humiliation, an unjust detainment. But she knew this ordeal was far from finished. The forces she opposed would not surrender quietly. Somewhere beyond these walls, powerful figures were already regrouping, planning their next move. And Alexis, heartbeat steady now, prepared herself to meet them head-on. The corridor felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of what had just transpired. Underwood and Daniel stood a few steps away, their postures stiff, eyes glittering with barely restrained fury. Behind Alexis, Judge Rothwell and a handful of supporters hovered protectively, forming a loose circle around her. Mitchell hovered at the edge, wringing his hands, phone still recording. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world damp and silent. A fragile calm before the next storm. Alexis squared her shoulders. She'd faced intimidation, public humiliation, and near detention. Now she understood. These men wanted to send a message, to stifle reform, and ensure no one dared challenge their power. They had retreated for a moment, but the way Underwood's gaze fixed on her, the way Daniels still hovered like a predator ready to pounce, told her it wasn't over. She would not be a victim in her own narrative. She was a judge, well-versed in the law, and she wasn't alone. The world was watching, through the crowd's phones, through the eyes of her allies, and soon, through media outlets that would pick up this story. She had leverage. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly, giving her a clear line of sight to Officer Daniels and Assistant DA Underwood. "Whatever game you're playing," she said, voice clear and carrying in the hush, "it ends now. You've tried intimidation, deceit, and baseless accusations. You've attempted to strip me of my dignity and authority. You failed." Daniels scoffed, rolling his shoulders like a boxer about to enter the ring. "You think you can come here and tell us how to run our justice system? You think your fancy title means something to real people who protect these communities every day?" Alexis stood firm. "If protecting your community means harassing an invited keynote speaker, detaining a judge without cause, and sowing fear, then I question what you're really protecting." Underwood thrust himself forward, finger jabbing the air. "Watch your tone. You don't know what we face here. Outsiders like you impose rules that tie our hands. Criminals walk free. We lose control. We're forced to bow to so-called reforms that favor offenders over victims." Alexis's heart tightened. This was the crux. They equated change with loss of control. "Reform is not about coddling criminals," she said, voice steady. "It's about ensuring fairness and equality, making sure no one is presumed guilty because of their background, and that everyone receives due process. If that threatens your hold on power, perhaps the problem lies not in the reform, but in your methods." A ripple of agreement swept through the onlookers. Rothwell stepped up beside her, arms crossed. "Underwood Daniels," he said, measured and calm, "you're on the brink of making a grave mistake. The Judicial Council, the Governor's office, they've been alerted. Any further misconduct will be broadcast widely." Daniels' face flushed crimson. He advanced, closing the distance between himself and Alexis until only a couple of feet separated them. She could see the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his belt. "We don't answer to you," he hissed, voice low. "We answer to the people here, the ones who live with the consequences of your high-minded ideals." Alexis felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't flinch. "The people deserve justice, not corruption masquerading as local control," she said softly. Then, raising her voice so all could hear, "You've shown your hand, Officer Daniels, harassing a judge, ignoring due process, threatening violence. That's not community protection, that's abuse of power." Underwood pushed Daniels aside, his face a tight mask. "Careful. Judge accusations like that require proof." The hallway went quiet. Alexis met Underwood's gaze head-on. "Proof we have recordings." She gestured toward Mitchell, whose phone camera still gleamed. Several others were doing the same, capturing every word. "We have witnesses, fellow judges, event organizers, state officials. You provided the proof yourselves, here and now." Underwood faltered, eyes flicking nervously to the phones. Daniels clenched his fists, chest heaving. "Shut those off," he barked suddenly, lunging toward Mitchell. The crowd gasped, stepping back. Mitchell yelped, clutching his phone tighter and stumbling against a wall. Alexis's stomach lurched. She moved instinctively, stepping into Daniel's path, raising a hand. "Don't," she said, voice resonating with a command honed in countless courtrooms. "You will not lay a hand on him." Daniels snarled, "Get out of my way!" He half raised his arm, as if to shove her. For a split second, the world hung in the balance. She didn't move. Instead, she fixed him with a glare so icy it could have frozen him in place. "Assaulting a judge, Officer Daniels?" she said quietly. "Think very carefully." In that moment, something cracked in Daniels. He realized how far he'd fallen, threatening a defenseless civilian, prepared to manhandle a judge in front of a crowd. His hand trembled, fingers curling into a tense claw. Underwood hovered behind him, uncertain now, caught in the trap of their own bluster. "You don't know what it's like," Daniels spat, voice raw. "These reforms mean fewer convictions, more scrutiny. We can't keep order if we're always second-guessed. The criminals will walk all over us. People like you don't live here, you don't see what we see." Alexis's gaze softened slightly, though her resolve did not waver. "I understand fear. I understand feeling cornered," she said. "But justice isn't about your convenience. It's not a shield for prejudice. Reforms happen because we've seen innocent people punished, and entire communities mistrust the system. You want respect, earn it by upholding the law, not bending it." Underwood stepped in, voice trembling with anger and desperation. "We're protecting our way of life. These rural communities operate differently. We don't need outsiders telling us how to handle our own." "Then improve from within," Alexis countered. "Don't dismiss every voice that calls for change. Don't treat fairness as an intrusion. If your methods are sound, they'll withstand scrutiny. If they're not, maybe it's time to acknowledge that harm is being done." A murmur of agreement rose behind her. Others stepped closer, lawyers, judges, local officials who had remained silent until now. Some had initially sided with Underwood's skepticism, but this display of aggression had changed minds. Every word Alexis spoke chipped away at the lie that she was here to upend their world maliciously. She was here to make it just. Daniel shook his head, rage turning to something like panic. "We can't just let criminals walk. We can't," Alexis cut him off, gentle but firm. "No one said you must let criminals walk. Good policing, fair trials, accountability. Those remain. What we're challenging is bias, rushed judgments, and brutality. If that's what you defend, then what does that say about you?"